tones we had provided as a starting point. To you, hearing it for the first time, this short exchange may be almost as difficult to understand as the EVP voice samples given earlier. Here's the exchange. Can't blame William for being a bit scared when he had his first communication with someone who had been among the so-called dead for 5 years. But he showed his own good sense when he remarked to Doc Nick, "Who do you think will believe anything like this?" Our position in releasing these materials is precisely that of Doc Nick when he replied, "Don't worry about that. It's not important, believe me." Those who scoff at this information, even after carefully evaluating this tape and the related printed materials, may later find themselves in the embarrassing position of one member of the French Academy of Sciences years ago. He told his learned colleagues, "I personally have examined Mr. Edison's phonograph, and I find that it is nothing but the clever use of ventriloquism." If some of you scoff at our breakthrough, it is probably because Doc Nick sounds a bit like a robot. We certainly agree that he does. But please recognize what you just heard for what it is. A start had been made toward someday getting continuous two-way conversation instead of jammed together bits and pieces, phrases that were characteristic of tens of thousands of the earlier EVP voice recordings.
One can only speculate on the degree to which these intrusive multiple tones can be attenuated and the voice content enhanced, bearing in mind that the bundle of pure tones is the raw material out of which the vocalization is created. An unknown factor is the degree of operator dependency. William had strong mediumistic abilities and probably contributed some form of psychic energy. As I've remarked many times on my own published tapes, I depended in my experiments on a fortunate combination of geophysical, local, and personal factors, operating on a radio receiver with certain anomalies. Radical changes in all these parameters in the late 70s effectively brought my experiments to a halt. The tonal brilliancy of Jurgensen's voices and my own cannot as yet be matched by the Spiricom machine. But, and this is the vital factor, and what constitutes the startling innovation of Spiricom, the contact was held through Spiricom for long periods. The informational content was far superior. The repartee was apposite, persistent and relevant, and uncontaminated by polyglot speech, where several languages are used in one sentence. And an overall impression is gained of a persistent, intelligent and narrowly directed attempt to communicate, which has succeeded brilliantly. Even the most experienced and hardened EVP experimenters are daunted and overwhelmed by the rapid exchanges on the meek tapes. Many are frankly incredulous, whilst expecting critics to accept their own, rather inferior results. Here are 3 contrasting EVP fragments for comparison with the Spiricom voices. Firstly, a girl's voice interrupts a phone conversation I was having with my wife and makes a pointed remark about a mutual acquaintance, still alive and resident in East Yorkshire. Naming her correctly as Lilo Shipley, not a common name, and regretting that Lilo wasn't bothered. In this particular case, the girl was referring to Lilo's disinterest in some EVP literature I'd loaned her.
Yeah. Aye. Okay. Yeah. I think, yeah. Well, you take whatever you want to.
Oui, j'ai fait totalement par...
I think, yeah. Well, you take whatever you want to.
Oui, j'ai fait totalement par...
I think, yeah. Well, you take whatever you want to.
Oui, j'ai fait totalement par...
In the next example from Friedrich Jurgensen, Friedrich had raised the question of man's treatment of laboratory animals. A male voice rushed in with a withering condemnation, one of the most hideous crimes, an insult to nature, a human atrocity, degenerate behaviour, but in due course, karma will redress the balance.
Ihr habt nicht gesagt wegen den Tieren.
Als eines der scheußlichsten Verbrechen. Ein Gräuel für die Natur. Ein Anschlag auf die Wirklichkeit. Eine Schändung der Humanität. Aber auf der Bühne des Prozesses kaum ein ausgestoßen.
Aber ihr habt nicht gesagt wegen den Tieren.
Als eines der scheußlichsten Verbrechen. Ein Gräuel für die Natur. Ein Anschlag auf die Wirklichkeit. Eine Schändung der Humanität. Aber auf der Bühne des Prozesses kaum ein ausgestoßen.
Ihr habt nicht gesagt wegen den Tieren.
Als eines der scheußlichsten Verbrechen. Ein Gräuel für die Natur. Ein Anschlag auf die Wirklichkeit. Eine Schändung der Humanität. Aber auf der Bühne des Prozesses kaum ein ausgestoßen.
After visiting a BBC studio in Hull in the middle 70s, I returned to my office and attempted to obtain voices. A guttural voice broke in, saying, "A medium is broadcasting." Here's an extract from the programme, and the voice commenting possibly on my role.
Paul Druitt reports. Raymond Cass is one of the amateur parapsychologists who've amassed a wealth of tape recordings of unexplained radio broadcasts. He lives in Limekiln Lane at Bridlington and has a business in Hull. He regularly monitors all frequencies at both places.
They've been given a name, electronic voice phenomena, EVP. Max Eastman has been trying to tune in to the right frequency.
The voices were first heard by the Swedish Army in 1934, but at that time they were put down to secret Nazi transmitting stations. They didn't, however, stop at the end of the war, and since then, well over 500,000 of them have been heard all over the world. Some have been recorded.
George Meek has said that the ultimate aim of the Spiricom team is to stabilize communications of a similar quality to those obtained by the London direct voice medium Leslie Flint. Here's a short extract from a Flint séance where Sir William Crookes, British scientist and psychical researcher who died in 1919, comments on modern EVP experiments at a séance in 1962.
These recent recordings which have aroused so much interest, even there, though it may not be perhaps apparent, there is the psychic force that is generated and used to make a contact possible. Of course, I might clarify this even further and say that it doesn't necessarily have to be human. By that I mean it does not necessarily have to be a man or woman who supplies the power that makes communication possible. It's very unlikely that you'll have, certainly not yet a while, intelligent conversation. You may have scraps here and there. So you see, we must always bear in mind that the varying levels of consciousness, the various levels of mental communication and transmission, artificially reproducing something appertaining to ourselves and our life, all this must be brought to you artificially. It must be reconstructed, recreated, and in the process some strange and extraordinary, and what from your point of view might be considered even weird results are obtained. But you must never lose sight of the fact that there are many levels of consciousness, and that as man survives the so-called grave, so do other forces of life and conditions of existence. But I do think you're going to have some sort of a muddle, but that doesn't lessen the reality of it, it doesn't lessen the value of it. Indeed, I'm all for this, and many of us here are concerned and interested, but there is a special group who are manifesting and working in this direction. But all sorts of other entities are sometimes mentally, as it were, floating by and transmitting even unconsciously sometimes our thoughts, which are coming through an intelligible sound of a kind, but very distorted. The distortion may disappear, it may become much more clear. It will vary according to the people that are present, let me tell you. And obviously if there is someone present who has strong mediumistic power, then the voices will improve and the communication will be vastly changed and different.
A final word by George Meek.
For the first time in mankind's history, it has been proven incontestably that death is merely a door to continuing life. Second, it is now certain that individual consciousness, what we often refer to as personality, continues to exist and function in a disease-free and pain-free environment. Third, the needless and destructive fear of death can be removed, as well as the deep concern over the passing of a loved one. Fourth, the taboo our culture has imposed on the whole subject of death can also be removed.
June 1991. New enquirers have been coming forward requesting material on the voices and claiming electronic, radio and computer expertise. And the following material, assembled by an American expert, Bill Weisensale, is aimed at investigators with a technical background. It is entitled Spirit Voice Receivers. Theory. In order to design a spirit voice receiving system, the first question to be answered is, how do the voices arrive? In essence, there are 4 hypotheses which may offer an explanation. We'll take a look at each in turn. Number 1, the electromagnetic hypothesis. This is the radio station in the sky concept, which supposes that the voices arrive in the form of ordinary radio signals. Presumably, each group of spirits carry about their own radio transmitter, which of course is both invisible and immaterial, in order to transmit radio signals during the course of EVP communications. The first fallacy in this hypothesis is that if it were true, then a radio receiver would be required in all EVP receiving systems, and no voices would be received by any method which did not involve a radio receiver. This does not correspond to the facts. Another fallacy in this hypothesis is the modulation versus mixing effect. It has been noted by practically every EVP researcher that the voices at times change broadcast voices or music into an EVP voice. In no case is the EVP voice mixed with the broadcast voice or music, as we would anticipate if there were a second radio signal present. Obviously, this is a case of one signal being modulated by another signal, not a case of 2 radio signals mixing together. Also, if the electromagnetic hypothesis were valid, then the spirits would be sending radio signals direct to our radio receivers. The EVP operator would not be a link in the system, and therefore all EVP researchers would have the same quality reception, and this doesn't correspond to the facts. Despite these obvious fallacies, a great deal of time and effort has been expended in attempting to learn on what frequency the voice is broadcast, and in attempts to build more sensitive, that is to say with better signal-to-noise ratio, radio receivers, in order to improve reception of what is presumed to be very weak radio signals, all of which, of course, has been to no avail. Number 2, the acoustic hypothesis. This is the spirits whispering into the microphone theory. Under this concept, the voices arrive in the form of sound waves, presumably created by vocal cords, which are both invisible and immaterial. Presumably, they're at a sub-audible level when picked up by the mic and become audible only after being amplified by the circuits of the recorder. This hypothesis also contains several fallacies, the first and most obvious of which is that if it were true, then all voice-receiving systems would have to contain a microphone, and no voice reception would be possible unless a microphone were present, which again is not the case. Another fallacy in this hypothesis is the modulation versus mixing effect. It has probably been noted by every EVP investigator that the voices at times change miscellaneous background sounds picked up by the microphone into EVP voices. In no case is the EVP voice mixed with the background noise, as one would anticipate if there were 2 simultaneous sounds. Again, very obviously, this is a case of one signal being modulated by another signal, not a case of 2 sounds mixing together. Also, if this hypothesis were true, then the ideal reception conditions would be a super quiet room, a super sensitive microphone, and a super good signal-to-noise ratio recorder. In reality, the signal-to-noise ratio of the recorder makes no difference at all, and in fact some of the best quality voices have been received on the worst recorders. Super-sensitive microphones and microphone preamplifiers make no discernible difference, and the miscellaneous background sounds, rather than drowning out the voices as one would anticipate, actually help them to become audible. Also, if the acoustic hypothesis were valid, the spirits would be whispering directly into the microphone. The EVP operator would not be a link in the receiving chain, Therefore, all EVP researchers would receive the same quality voices. Again, this simply does not correspond with the facts. 3. The combination hypothesis. Under this concept, the spirits use more than one means of causing their voices to appear, depending upon the receiving system in use. If we use a radio receiver, then they obligingly transmit a radio signal to us. If we use the microphone, then they obligingly whisper into the microphone, etc. The fallacy in this hypothesis is that the voices appear in receiving systems which do not contain a microphone, and which at the same time can be totally shielded from radio signals. In fact, as we shall see later, the voices can and do appear in systems in which there is neither a radio receiver, a microphone, nor even a tape recorder. Again, if the combination hypothesis is valid, then the spirits would either be sending us direct radio signals, or they would be whispering directly into the microphone, depending on which method was in use. In either case, the operator would not be a link in the system, and therefore, again, all EVP researchers would receive similar quality voices, which again does not correspond with the facts. 4. The psychokinetic hypothesis. This hypothesis states that an electronic signal generated by static, broadcast voices, or music, background sounds, internal white noise, etc., exists in all spirit voice receiving systems, and that at one or more places in the system, this electronic signal is voice modulated by psychokinetic energy. That the signal level in an electronic circuit can be affected by psychokinetic energy has been demonstrated by Mr. Ingo Swann under laboratory conditions at both New York City College and at the Stanford Research Institute. Under the psychokinetic hypothesis, the voices arrive by directly modulating the electronic signal inside of the equipment. There are no sound waves or radio signals. Since there is no known barrier to psychokinetic energy, we could design an experiment in which no microphone is used and in which the whole receiving system is electromagnetically shielded. If EVP voices appear under these conditions, then we know by the process of elimination that they arrived in the form of psychokinetic energy, since they could not be acoustic or electromagnetic. In experiments of this nature, results are in agreement with the psychokinetic hypothesis. Also, since spirits are out of the body and therefore not physical, we could anticipate that they could communicate by mental rather than physical means. Under the psychokinetic hypothesis, the spirits do not need physical devices such as radio transmitters or vocal cords. They could be communicating by using psychokinetic energy, which is, of course, a strictly mental process. Another point which needs to be mentioned is the mixing versus modulation effect. Under the psychokinetic hypothesis, there would be, in theory, two possible means by which the voices would enter the circuit. First, they could create a second signal and inject this signal into the circuit at one or more points, much as we use a signal injector when troubleshooting. Or second, they could psychokinetically affect the electronic characteristics of one or more components. If we look at these two possibilities closely, we note that the first method is physical, whereas the second method is mental. We also note that the first method would result in a mixing effect, whereas the second possibility, in which they would vary, for example, the resistance of a resistor, the conduction of a transistor, the decay rate of the electromagnetic field in a transformer, or the flux density of one of the permanent magnets, etc., etc., and there are dozens of possibilities, by using psychokinetic energy would result in a modulation effect on whatever electronic signal happened to be passing through the system at the time. At this point, we've no reason to believe that it is possible to psychokinetically inject a second signal into a circuit. However, we do know from previously mentioned laboratory experiments that it is possible for psychokinetic energy to change the signal level in an electronic circuit, and we could therefore presume that this would be the mode of operation. This, of course, would cause modulation of the signal rather than mixing, and this again agrees with experimental results. Under the psychokinetic hypothesis, only three conditions need exist in order for voice reception to occur. 1. There must be an electronic signal present which contains random or multi-frequencies within the voice band. This signal may be generated by radio static, radio broadcast voices or music, radio white noise, miscellaneous or deliberate microphone sounds, or white noise within the tape recorder, etc., or any combination thereof. The actual source of the electronic signal makes little difference. The only thing really required is that such a signal be present within the circuits or of whatever equipment happens to be in use. The electronic signal must pass through one or more components, devices, or circuits whose electronic characteristics are subject to change under the influence of psychokinetic energy. At this point or points, the envelope of the electronic signal is changed to correspond to the spirit voice. That is, the signal is psychokinetically voice modulated. This component, device or circuit, which is subject to the influence of psychokinetic energy, and in which the signal is voice modulated, is called the psychokinetic modulator or the PK mod. At this point, the only device definitely known to act as a psychokinetic modulator is the speaker microphone coupling, although other devices, such as tape recording heads, are under suspicion. 3. The signal must be amplified to listening or recording level and applied to an output device, such as a speaker, earphones, or a tape recording head. If the psychokinetic hypothesis is valid, then any time the about 3 requirements are met, EVP voices could potentially appear. We would expect, for example, that they could appear when playing back any kind of tape on a tape recorder, or during the course of copying a tape through a patch cord from one recorder to another. And again, this does agree with experimental results. As a bottom line, the electromagnetic, acoustic, and combination hypothesis can be eliminated from further practical consideration because of their various and serious contradictions with experimental results. The psychokinetic concept is the only one of the 4 able to withstand close scrutiny and can therefore be taken as a working hypothesis. If the psychokinetic hypothesis is valid, the question immediately arises as to where the energy originates. On the one hand, if our equipment is being directly affected by the spirits, then the operator would not be a link in the chain, and we would anticipate that all EVP researchers would receive approximately the same quality voices. Conversely, if communication is indirect, that is, if the spirits telepathically activate the operator's subconscious psychokinetic ability and thus cause their voices to appear in the equipment through the use of the operator's energy, then we could anticipate that a few individuals who happen to have PK ability would get good quality EVP reception, while for most of the others it would be non-existent. The fact of the matter is, both of these effects seem to be in evidence. On the one hand, it is undeniable that a few people are EVP mediums, and for them reception is relatively good. On the other hand, insofar as we know, anyone who has the patience and determination to train their ears and minds for EVP reception, and this may require weeks or even months, will be able to discern and understand EVP voices. To answer our question, then, it appears that the necessary psychokinetic energy can and does originate in the spirit communicator or in the subconscious of the EVP operator, depending on whether or not the operator is an EVP medium. Bill Weisensale goes on to speculate at length on the practical possibilities in the construction of a spirit voice receiver. From the foregoing, it's clear, and this accords with my own experience, that a great deal depends upon the operator's psychokinetic ability. But almost anyone with sufficient patience can receive voices, because the majority of humans have some PK ability of their own. Certain individuals, however, such as Rowdeeve and Jurgensen, and probably myself, would appear to possess this PK energy in excess, which would account for their clear and sometimes very loud voices. It now seems certain that the operator is a link in the chain, possibly via his subconscious, receiving telepathic impulses from outside intelligences. It seems that the spirit initiates a process whereby his or her message is moulded by using the operator's PK energy, probably via his subconscious. Coming back to the question of Germany for a moment, if large numbers of experimenters plunge into EVP experimentation, then a proportion of these will discover their EVP mediumship, and enthusiasm amongst onlookers will be stimulated, so that many more will have a go, leading to further successes. Thus a snowball effect will ensue, in contradistinction to the mere handful of people in the United Kingdom who initiate experiments, with only a minute number likely to exhibit EVP mediumship. And a general and depressive decline effect will follow. In Germany, whilst we don't know how many failed in their efforts to record paranormal voices, we do know that hundreds succeeded, and in their fortnightly or monthly meetings in the local pub, reinforcement and positive attitudes have taken place. I shall complete this side of the tape by including some of my earlier voices recorded in the early 1970s. These are for the benefit of new inquirers who may not be familiar with the peculiarities of the EVP utterances. First, I'd like to quote from the late Dr. Zenta Maurina, Doctor of Philosophy and translator of Slavonic languages, who examined hundreds of voice examples in the early 1970s, and I quote, "These voices from beyond, if we may refer to them thus, differ from ordinary voices one hears on the radio. They have a certain hoarseness, and sound as if the person speaking was suffering from laryngitis, though every now and again you can get a perfectly clear-sounding voice. The voice entity's speech is also much softer and much more rapid than that of ordinary human beings, and has its own strange timbre. The unusual quality of the language, as well as the text spoken, rule out the idea that the voices may be no more than freak sounds emitted by radio transmitting stations. At first, one has the impression that these voices do not know how to speak properly. They sound as if they were stumbling through alien languages they haven't mastered. But after one has detected and understood perhaps 100 voices, one begins to realize that this odd way of speaking follows certain rules and has certain recurring characteristic features that cannot possibly be repeated by mere coincidence. 1. Sentences are rarely composed in a single language. Predominant is the language of the experimenter, usually his or her mother tongue. When Konstantin Rowdeeve experiments, the language is mainly Latvian. When it is Friedrich Jurgensen, Swedish or Italian. With Valery Tarsis, the Russian writer, it is Russian. 2. None of the languages spoken are used in the grammatically and philologically correct manner. Sometimes German endings are given to Latvian words and vice versa. Swedish words become Germanized or Russianized. The language is curt and concise. Articles, prepositions, and auxiliary verbs are usually left out. Word economy is rigorous. Fragmented sentences, neologisms, and shortened words are the rule." End of quote. The recording methods I used in those early days are described in the booklet, the Raymond Cass Report, which should accompany this tape. At a much later date, and after long negative periods intervened, and all the parameters of my experiments had been disturbed or radically changed, I commenced to experiment with a scanner, which scans certain VHF frequencies at over 400 channels a minute, and is only halted by an intervention. This radio cannot be tampered with or modified, even by experts, and is not subject to transmitter breakthrough, thus obviating the earlier criticisms of the EVP that it was simply distant radio stations misinterpreted by the experimenter. It is not known, however, how the voice entities can zero in milliseconds and push through some relevant remarks, or use my name and refer to my current thoughts and actions. During the course of my voice experiments, I've received 3 voices of suicides I've known. In each case, there was no indication of joy at the release from physical existence. The latest one came over the scanner and is the voice of a friend, a highly successful sign writer who put a shotgun in his mouth with horrific results, horrific to those who found him in his garage. This was an experiment in direct response, where the microphone of the mini recorder is picking up my comments and any response from the voice entity. In this case, you'll hear a subdued voice declaring cryptically, "A cave extra." What could he possibly mean? A cave is a gloomy place. Well, Norman was a native of the twin villages of North and South Cave in Yorkshire. After his suicide, he finds himself, therefore, in a cave extra, not the oblivion he sought, but just another cave. So consciousness survives the death of the physical body, and one cannot jump off the bus of life so easily. So here it is, an instant response voice over the scanner, which at the time was racing over untenanted frequencies, and came to a halt when the voice broke in.
This is Raymond Cass on a quiet day in Humpton, 1st of November, 1988. And I'm reflecting on a friend, Norman Crosby, who took his own life with a shotgun not many months ago. Norman, you visited us at Alpha. And I know you had problems. And I know you had problems.
The next example is remarkable by any standards. Raudeven Jorgensen always maintained that the voice entities could under certain conditions see us and be aware of our activities, in a room for instance, and I found this hard to accept, despite the fact that the first voice I ever received was in German and a comment on the fact that I was taking a swig of whiskey to try to help a cold. "Give me a schnapps," said the voice in German. Give me schnapps, schnapps being like gin or vodka. In the present instance, I was set up with my scanner and recorder, a mini recorder, for an experiment, but I hadn't officially started. I was idly glancing through that morning's Daily Mail when my eye fell casually on a full-page advert, part of a government anti-crime series, I think. It depicted a group of yobbos kicking a man on the ground with onlookers hurrying by or staring at the scene. Over the scanner comes a panicky voice, a young male voice, Southern English, I think, pleading, "Don't do it, don't do that to him." As I said, I'd glanced at it only casually. It was just a black and white advert, an imaginary scenario, and I felt no emotion. But the voice entity did. Now the question arises, did the owner of the voice see the scene through the filter of my mind and take it as a real crisis? Or did the technicians, Jorgensen's copyists, insert it as a demonstration of their awareness, just as Jorgensen received contacts with deceased persons with all the sound effects of the accidents which carried them off? The full-page ad arrested my attention for only a fraction of a second, but enough to enable the entities to put through a lightning comment. Here's another curious voice with a concealed, evidential content. One evening, during the course of an experiment, I asked the communicators what my friend, the pioneer voice experimenter, Spencer Wilson, was doing at that moment. An immediate response came over the scanner. He sat holding his waistcoat. Now I knew that Spencer never wore a waistcoat. Indeed, as a young schoolmaster, he dressed in the casual garb of his peers. A seemingly silly remark. I phoned him to get his reaction. "Ah," he said, "my father, Spencer Wilson Sr., was a waistcoat freak. He had a wardrobe full of fancy waistcoats and was always buying more." So the voice inserted a little bit of evidence, which checked out unexpectedly.
I hope Spencer Wilson is working tonight. And I hope Spencer Wilson is working tonight. I hope Spencer Wilson is working tonight.
Not every communication is easily resolved. In the next example, I was talking about my long interest in the problem of survival when a voice broke in saying, "Possible?" So far, so good. But the voice continued in a moment saying, "Detectives sent you nights away." What does he mean? I failed to read any sense into that pronouncement.
I have wondered about the fate of their soul or spirit in a possible afterlife. And so, from an early age, I've been interested in the problem of human survival. I've worked, studied, read, experimented, and spent a great deal of time in this work. Experimented, and spent a great deal of time in this work. Experimented, and spent a great deal of time in this work.
My grandfather, Thomas Ray, was a lifelong opponent of religion and expected only oblivion and eternal sleep after death. Never once did he manifest through any kind of a medium or psychic since his death in 1936. Using the scanner one evening, I concentrated my thoughts on him for a while and was rewarded with a rather grudging Thomas in his gruff voice. In his lifetime, he was a successful businessman, but a great materialist in every sense of the word. Singing voices are a rare but fascinating side of the EVP. The next example is an instant response. I address the entities over the open mic and ask for a singing voice, or in German, eine singende Stimme. Stimme is voice. A charming and young-sounding female instantly responds, saying, "A Singstimmchen." Stimmchen is the diminutive of die Stimme and means a little voice. Her response in this uncommon but legitimate German was fast upon my heels, and one has the impression of the entities monitoring the experimenter closely, selecting the right moment to butt in, and also an appropriate remark. There's certainly a bit of magic here.
Can we have a singing voice, eine singende Stimme? Can we have a singing voice, eine singende Stimme? What? So the experiment does take place on both sides of the divide, and obviously technicians are involved. But available time is minimal, and close synchronization is essential, and many experiments obviously go astray, but occasionally there is a success. Bill Weisensale agrees that almost anyone can obtain the voices, but there are such people as EVP Mediums, who frequently obtain louder and more consistent results. The following remark by an entity seems to confirm this. I'd returned to my office after a short session in a local TV studio, speaking about the EVP, and I switched on my setup, and immediately a foreign-sounding voice came over saying, "A medium is broadcasting," presumably me.
Io mi scrolla.